Now we come to our keynote speaker, who no doubt will bring everything together or tear everything apart. We'll see how it goes. Jonathan Kay is a Toronto-based columnist and book author. His work appears regularly in the National Post, the Washington Post, The Atlantic, CBC.ca, and Foreign Affairs magazine. He is a frequent panelist on CBC's The National and on CJAD Radio in Montreal. His books include Among the Truthers, Harper's Call in 2011, and Legacy, How French Canadians Shaped North America, Signal 2016. He tweets daily on the news. His handle is @JohnK. His podcast, Wrong Thing, will begin airing in January 2018, co-hosted with Deborah So. I'd like to welcome Jonathan Kay.
Thank you. That was that introduction made me laugh. When I was asked to speak here, the organizers said something very interesting to me. They said that all the organizers have endured the atrocities of genocide. Our families settled in Canada because their families were escaping genocide. And although I have not been personally touched by this subject, certainly it's true of my family. And so I'll just start by talking a little bit about my background. I don't know how many people in this room are familiar with 23andMe, the company where you send in a DNA sample and they send you a map where your ancestors came from. And in the advertisements for 23andMe, they always feature like a sort of a peppy middle-aged person who says, "Oh, I'm 17% black, I didn't even realize, and I'm 4% Hawaiian." And I thought, oh, this is fantastic. I'll be able to interject myself in every debate about regional or ethnic issues and say, well, as somebody who's 4% Kurdish, let me just say that. However, and I did this, and the results were horrifyingly predictable. Every single dot on the map came from exactly where one would think an Ashkenazi Jew comes from. My ethnic diversity stretches from Germany to Russia and every point in between. And I think the most exotic dot on the map was I think I had an ancestor in southern Denmark. This was the end of it. The reality is that my ancestors lived in a swath of Europe that certainly throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, there were all sorts of pogroms. Genocide, unfortunately, was rife there. It's what one author called the Great Bloodlands of Europe. My father's family fled from Russia, fled Stalin, fled to China, just in time for China's bloodletting to begin in the 30s and 40s. And from there, they escaped to Canada, essentially as refugees. My mother's family escaped in the other direction. Before Hitler came to power, they fled across the Atlantic to Canada, and they both ended up in Montreal. Both families fled persecution and slaughter, and because they did that, I've been able to grow up in freedom in what I regard to be the greatest country on earth. Because of the sacrifices those families made and survived, I can enjoy the freedoms we have in Canadian society. And I think probably many other people in this room have similar stories. And that happens to be my story. In terms of the larger subject that we're talking about today, genocide, I actually put a note on one of my social media pages saying that I would be at this event and I'd be talking about the subject of genocide. And a friend of mine, a longtime friend who I'll return to later, his name is Talat. And Talat said to me, he said, don't forget to mention what's happening in Yemen, and don't forget to mention what's happening to the Rohingya in Myanmar and in Bangladesh. And I said, thank you. And as I typed the words thank you, I thought to myself, how profoundly depressing is it that there are so many acts of slaughter going on in the world that one has to be reminded to include this or that. The Rohingya, we know about a little bit from the front pages. What's happening in Yemen is more obscure to many people. It's a country that a lot of people probably couldn't find on a map, and it hasn't been covered as much, even as the Rohingya crisis. But the stakes are actually very high. There's talk of mass starvation possibly in that country and hundreds of thousands of people dying. And as I was taking notes, I thought of all the other places where there's been horrible acts of slaughter. Certainly Syria comes to mind. In Libya, I don't know if people saw the news, there was apparently an open slave market that's recently been operating in Libya. So there's unfortunately no end of horrors still in the world. This speech will become more cheery later on, I promise. And I think there's a temptation when you see this news to say, well, it's the same old story, mankind's evil upon mankind. I think there are some changes when we talk about genocide. Certainly one of the changes is the way we use technology. And I think the Rohingya is a good example. Many people I know who don't follow world affairs closely know about the Rohingya because of the pictures, because the Toronto Star or the National Post will put on their front page a horrible image of a mother and a child trying to escape. And 10 or 20 years ago, that might not have happened, because somebody might not have had the technology in their hand to take a picture like that and transmit it around the world. So that part really has changed. And while it is true that people are still doing horrible, horrible things to each other around the world, the technology to document it has changed. And I think here in Canada, we've especially felt this for both emotionally for the worse, but from a policy point of view for the better, in the way we responded to that horrible picture of a small child washing up on the shore of a Greek beach. And that was such a powerful picture that it actually changed the face of policy in many Western nations, including Canada. And there are tens of thousands of Syrian refugees who have rightly been admitted to Canada, in part because of the emotional power those pictures have played. So technology has changed the face of how we respond to mass slaughter and suffering. And it is interesting to think about what the world response might have been to the Holocaust, or to the Armenian genocide, or to the Rwandan genocide, had that technology existed back then. And so that has changed for the better. On the other hand, there are limits to this technology. One of the biggest limitations is that this technology tends to be reactive. We tend to become mobilized to help only after the slaughter has begun and the pictures start to emerge. And by that time, it's often too late. The other problem is that this kind of video and photo technology can be weaponized by the other side of the debate, by anti-humanitarians. I would point you, by way of example, to Trump's notorious tweet from a few days ago, in which Trump, I believe it was a retweet of a message from a notorious right-wing racist group that included references to videos purporting to show Muslims beating up a disabled person in the Netherlands, I think. And this is the kind of video that is circulated to arouse hostility toward minority groups and to suppress humanitarian impulses and to stir up xenophobia and racism. So the same technology that's used to capture a horrifying image of a 4-year-old child on a beach and to arouse our humanitarian impulses can also be used to suppress our humanitarian impulses. The larger question, I think, is why, in this day and age, scenes of mass slaughter are still so common. And for this, I noticed that the crowd is divided between old and young. I'm certainly old enough to remember the period in the late 80s and the early 90s when there was this great rhapsodic belief that the Cold War was over and we were going to put an end to crimes against humanity and perhaps even genocide, because there was going to be this new world order and everything was going to be governed by law, even international relations, and even the way that sovereign powers dealt with their internal populations. And we got the International Criminal Court, and we had the emergence of the right to protect doctrine, which was about primarily Western countries, their responsibility in some cases to intervene within countries to prevent acts of mass murder. And you had special purpose entities like the Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and you had interventions in Africa, including a particularly effective intervention by British Special Forces in Sierra Leone. And I remember in the late 90s, which is about the time I became a journalist, that there was this feeling that we had the elements in place to perhaps make genocide and mass slaughter a thing of the past. And it hasn't turned out that way at all. And in my view, the main reason it hasn't worked out is because the entire structure of international law and diplomacy in this area has been built around the idea of extending the concept of individual criminal responsibility to nations. In fact, we even call these new entities, International Criminal Court, and we use the proceduralism of criminal law as it's applied to individuals, and we apply it to nations. And we have a whole typology of crime. We talk about crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing, and there's a richly developed legal subculture, which is all about the typology of these crimes, which extends the metaphor of individual criminal responsibility to nations and to leaders. But what we've learned is this doesn't work, because individuals within societies are bound by the laws of those societies. And there's a constabulary that can come and arrest you, and there are prosecutors that can hold you to the standards of those societies. But there is no universal standard that holds nations to one single account. We've tried that with the League of Nations and the United Nations and other supranational bodies, and those things tend not to work because different societies have different value systems. And what's worse is that most acts of genocide and mass murder are committed by dictators who are empowered precisely because the population is looking for a strongman to step outside of the current moral system because they see their country under some perceived threat. And all of these crimes tend to be justified under that idea. If you look at some of the examples, Bashar Assad in Syria will consistently say that he is fighting terrorism. And some of the people who have attacked his regime are in fact terrorists, but a lot of them are actually simply people who want to assert their rights, including their rights to not be ruled by an Alawite minority in that country. Donald Trump justifies a lot of his actions on the idea that the United States is under siege from a wave of immigrants. In World War II, internment camps for Japanese were justified on that basis. In our own country, in Canada, racist measures often were taken under the idea that our country was under existential threat from Asian drug dealers. There were whole books written about this supposed threat a century ago, or Jewish moneylenders and that sort of thing. Mixed race marriage was seen as an existential threat to the white race in the 19th century and the 20th century. And this was seen as a justification for some of the horrific racist abuses that took place. The Armenian genocide is to this day justified by many Turkish nationalists by saying that this was a military necessity that was needed to protect the state. And this is the way that all acts of mass slaughter tend to be justified. A lot of criminal statutes, including the criminal laws that's applied internationally, is built around the idea of mens rea and evil. But dictators don't see themselves as acting in an evil way. They see themselves as acting according to some perceived, existentially felt national need. And when nations are caught up in that kind of hysteria and social panic, they admire these dictators and they empower them precisely because they flout international standards. So to say things like we'll never again, or we'll create international standards, or we'll have this 14-point manifesto that spells out exactly how countries are supposed to work, and the principles that they should abide by in the treatment of minorities, those are the first things to go when countries get caught up in waves of social panic. And one small example of this is President Duterte in the Philippines. Our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, just upbraided Duterte because Duterte has done what he campaigned on when he became president of the Philippines, is that he was going to go around and start murdering alleged drug dealers without any due process whatsoever. It's essentially state-sanctioned mass murder. He campaigned on that promise, he got elected, and that's what he's doing. Many voters in the Philippines are perfectly happy to see him do this atrocity because they see their cities under threat from drugs, and they've decided that they want a strongman who's going to step outside the established system of norms and the treatment, due process, and civil liberties. And in a climate like that, the legalisms that have become the stock and trade in the battle against crimes against humanity really have no meaning. It should also be said that in these great national projects, which go horrifically wrong, often it is a revolutionary spirit which accompanies some of the worst abuses. Because the idea is that any horrific crime against a minority is justified in order to achieve some revolutionary ideal. Which is why, to this day, many Russians turn a blind eye toward what happened to Ukrainians, the Holodomor. Millions upon millions of people, mass starvation, because that was seen as a project that was necessary to build a communist paradise. And in fact, some of the most horrific genocides of the 20th century were not even motivated by ethnicity or religion, but by pure ideology. The genocide that a lot of people don't talk about is the Cambodian genocide. Pol Pot's annihilation of approximately a quarter of the Cambodian population. Largely along ideological lines. There was an ethnic aspect to a certain extent within Cambodia's population, but largely it was an insane war of extermination against people who were perceived to be intellectuals or counter-revolutionaries. I read a book about it a couple of years ago, and you could get annihilated just because you wore glasses, which was seen as a sign of intellectualism. So I have learned to be particularly wary of revolutionary and utopian movements because their dark side is often far darker than other systems of thought. So these are my thoughts on preventing genocide, which are somewhat pessimistic because it's embedded in the tribalistic spirit of the human condition. We try and create safeguards. Those safeguards are the first things to go as soon as countries get caught up in waves of xenophobia and social panic. And although we became convinced that Western countries could intervene in the 1990s, we've since then had examples that show that Western intervention often can just make things worse. And I think Iraq and Afghanistan, which were not conceived as humanitarian interventions, but essentially became nation-building exercises after the fact, and some of the horrors that have been created in the wake of those, ISIS, for instance, there is an understandable reluctance to invoke the principles of R2P, responsibility to protect, in real life, because we see that it just as easily could go horribly wrong. And a lot of the people who criticize Barack Obama for not intervening more forcefully in Syria, I agree to a certain extent, because you never say, well, it's a red line if you use chemical weapons, if you don't intend to do anything when someone crosses that red line. I do think it's a very open question about whether intervention in that country would have made things better or made things worse. So that's one challenge, is preventing future acts of mass slaughter around the world. But the other challenge we have is, what's the proper way to respond to the genocides of the past? And I love the fact that we're having this conversation in a Canadian Armenian center, because the way Turkey remembers what we call the Armenian genocide, and the way Canada is starting to come to terms with some of the dark episodes in its past, show the different paths you can take. In Turkey, there's still this neurotic defensiveness about confronting the horrors of the past. At some point in that nation's history, that will end. Hasn't ended yet. Whereas in Canada, I think we're embarking on the opposite path. And that's a path of being candid and seeking reconciliation and trying to make amends to the extent one can make amends for the horrors of the past, particularly in regard to residential schools and some of the other tragedies that have been inflicted on indigenous people. And I began the speech by talking a little bit about my own past, and my family's past. And so I thought maybe I would share some of the lessons I've learned from my Jewish heritage. I'm not certainly by no means a observant Jew, but culturally I've learned a lot of lessons from my Jewish heritage. Because Jews are much farther along in this process, I think, than indigenous people in Canada. Because the world started paying real attention to what happened in the Holocaust, probably in the mid to late 50s. Even in Israel, there wasn't actually a lot of talk about the Holocaust in the first decade after the Second World War. Many people didn't want to talk about it. It's when grandparents started talking about it that there was an initiative and Yad Vashem was built and that sort of thing. And so for certainly at least the last half century, the world, and especially the Western world, has gone deep and wide in its spirit of contrition and acceptance of the horrors that have been vested upon the Jews, particularly with the Holocaust, but other acts of anti-Semitism. And I am the beneficiary of that. I live in a world of Schindler's List. I live in a world where Holocaust denial is deeply stigmatized as pathological. And so I can take it for granted that reasonable mainstream people understand the horrors that Jewish people have endured. And I often say to people that to be a white male Jew like myself I'm the most privileged member of Canadian society because I'm white and male and get all the privilege that goes with that. But when conversations turn to minority status and victimhood, sometimes I even get benefit for that too. And I don't get lumped in with WASPs who are seen as having no redeeming qualities in that respect. As I say, in terms of the indigenous conversation, we are much less advanced in coming to terms with some of the horrors that have been inflicted upon that community. We are closer in Jewish time to being in the 60s and 70s, when people were first starting to come to terms with that and trying to figure out what was the best way to promote healing. And in that spirit, I thought I would share some of the lessons that I have learned from the way the Jewish community, certainly in Canada, has dealt with a legacy of genocide against Jews. Because obviously, in general, I would rather live in a country like Canada, which comes to terms with these historical horrors, than a country like Turkey, which still tries to sweep them under the carpet. But I should say that there are pitfalls. And one of the pitfalls that I have learned is that as great as it is to learn the lessons of the past, sometimes the lessons of the past can be inadvertently weaponized against other groups. And I have seen this in the Jewish community a little bit. There is understandably, especially in Montreal, where the Jewish community was much more dominated by Holocaust survivors and their descendants than the Toronto Jewish community. The shadow of the Holocaust still often looms over every conversation. And it often looms over policy discussions too. So that the idea of protecting Jews and the societies they inhabit from anti-Semitism is weaponized as a way to go after other minority groups, such as Muslims. And it is absolutely true that there is anti-Semitism in the Islamic community. That fact is often, to my mind, excessively promoted by certain sectors of the Jewish community, sometimes in ways that I find Islamophobic. And sometimes the legacy of the Holocaust and the noble and important mission to prevent any kind of further Holocaust perpetrated either in Israel or, God forbid, any other country, those fears are stoked in a way that is weaponized against other minority groups. And when that happens, I try to call that out. Because in my mind, the best way to remember the horrors that have been inflicted against one group is to make sure those horrors aren't inflicted not only against your group, but against every group. And when you weaponize it and you use it as a propaganda point against, say, admitting Muslim migrants or trying to attack them on social media, to my mind, that is absolutely the wrong lesson to learn from your own history. The other thing that you see, and we saw this a little bit when they were creating the Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg, is that we can get a perverse situation where victimhood becomes a somewhat competitive game, where I remember when the Human Rights Museum was built in Winnipeg, I would get press releases from this and that group, which were often surreal. They would say, well, Group A got their exhibit and it's 800 square feet. Ours is 900 square feet, but it's closer to the bathroom. We should have 1,200 square feet if we're close to the bathroom. And these were surreal and weird, but they made a certain kind of sense when you think that, well, it's a zero-sum game. Society has only so much time to pay attention to the past. If they're paying attention to the Rwandan genocide, maybe that's less time for my genocide. And I think in Winnipeg they sorted that out. From what I understand, the Human Rights Museum has been more of a success than cynics like me thought. But at the same time, I think groups should be wary of that sort of thing. The other problem is that sometimes a focus on the lessons of the past and victimhood can create an obsession with bloodline that in perverse ways can mimic the obsession with bloodline that can lead to genocides themselves. And people will say, well, I have a right to interpret the legacy of such and such a historical horror because my bloodline is purer than yours. I know that this is done in a very different spirit from people who focus on bloodline as a way to attack people and stigmatize people, but focusing on the contents of people's blood is always the wrong way to organize a human society in every context. And I object to it completely on principle, no matter what the motivations behind it. In general, I would say that when we're thinking of fighting intolerance in our society, we have a tendency to think big. If you go on social media, and I know this from spending years as comment editor at the National Post, people just love to talk about the origins of this, anti-Semitism, and who's the rightful heir to Eretz Yisrael, and whose fault was the World War I anyway, and Germans are this, and to sort of reduce everything to grand geopolitical moral questions of which civilization has suffered more and which civilization is more righteous and who is more sinned against and I find these extremely tiresome and not helpful in the slightest. I often find it more helpful to take a much smaller, more micro approach to the way we deal with things and deal with things interpersonally. And I'm going to go back. Remember at the beginning I talked about my friend Talat. He's the guy who reminded me to talk about the Rohingya and to talk about what's happening in Yemen. And Talat was my first Muslim friend. We met in grade 5, I think, at Selwyn House High School in Montreal. I was one of 3 Jews in the class, and I think he might have been the only Muslim. And this was a school where we still did Christian prayers before lunch. And I think, it was very monarchist, and it was sort of one of those last holdouts of Victorian England that Montreal still had at the time. And I'd love to say that the two of us were best friends because we fought the WASP establishment together. But that's actually not the case at all. We were typical schoolboys in the 70s and 80s, and people called each other, Nicholas Chorizo, we called him a wop, and I was called a kike, and Talat was a packy, and we used horrible, horrible names to refer to each other. The French people were peppers. We used all the gutter insults that horrid little boys used to address each other at the time. I was able to brush it off because I graduated and I assimilated into white society, and no one knows that I'm Jewish unless I tell them. My friend Talat, on the other hand, had a harder time because he was a member of a visible minority, and he couldn't just laugh off the high school racism he endured. And we still live in a society that is marked by white privilege and that is infected by racism. And he still has to endure that. And I remember that, and I'm thankful that he has forgiven me for the things I said and did when I was younger, and that we have remained friends. And have remained friends, in fact, for 35 years, to the point that when I'm giving a speech in a place like this, he's the one on my Facebook page who reminds me, says, you're going to spend time talking about your people's legacy of genocide, talk about my people too. And I'm glad he was there to say that. And in a way, he said that because of Canadian multiculturalism. for all the horridness we little schoolboys inflicted on each other back in Selwyn House, we still remain friends. And trust me, my kids are living in a very different Canada, and his kids are living in a very different Canada than the 70s and 80s. At my kids' school, if somebody were to say kike or wop or something like that, they'd probably be suspended for a week. They wouldn't just be brushed off as the jackanapes of a bunch of 12-year-olds. And I think that's a great thing, but I also think it's a testament to some of the benefits of multiculturalism. When we talk about multiculturalism, we often emphasize all the positive things. The food and the languages and the dress, and I think that's great. But multiculturalism has another benefit in that people from different backgrounds can remind us of their own culture's horrific experiences with hatred and bigotry. And my friend Talat, I talk about doing little things to improve the world. When there was a horrible earthquake in Pakistan, I guess about a decade ago, Talat actually went to Pakistan. He's a world-famous surgeon now, and he went to Pakistan and operated out of a tent and saved countless lives. And then he came back to Canada, and he told me about it, and I said, you have to write an article for the National Post about it. And he did. He wrote a full-page article about what he'd done. And one of the reasons, I mean, it was a great article, and the man's a hero as far as I'm concerned. But one of the reasons I wanted him to write it was that a lot of the people who read the National Post and might have certain ideas about Muslims, I wanted them to think about this Canadian doctor who left his comfortable life in Toronto and went back to Pakistan and saved lives. Because that's not always the story they read about. But I wanted it to be the story they read about on that day. And I think it's messages like that, it's people in our peer group, it's making sure that we have a diversity of people that we're listening to and we're not just drinking from the same fire hose when we're getting our social media feeds. If you're from Group X, it's really easy to spend your entire day listening and hearing about all the atrocities being inflicted on the world on Group X. I think you should also listen to all the atrocities being inflicted on Groups Y and Z and all the letters of the alphabet, because sadly there's more than enough to go around. And on that cheery note, I'll stop talking. Thank you. It's more traditional when I talk questions and diatribes, because sometimes people like to get up and they don't have to ask a question. They can sometimes just air a complaint about anything I said.
Well, I mean, I could tell a story.
Okay.
That would avoid. No.
Sure.
But I mean, if people...
I will just echo your speech a little bit. Unfortunately, I'm one of survivors of genocide of 1987. I don't like to go in those painful details because it leads to emotions. But where I live, it was Azerbaijan, and violation of human rights started when we weren't allowed to speak out about all fundings. Like we weren't allowed to speak about our culture and exercise attend church, Christianity, speak own language, and show that we're Armenian. We had to hide. This first was violation, and we weren't allowed to voice that this exists there. Then that led to discrimination, where we weren't allowed to have high position, to attend university. We had to move to Armenia or to Russia, because in Azerbaijan it was very limited for Armenians, or you had to pay under table to professors to graduate at university. And then all that led to genocide, which happened in 1988, My point, I like to stop this, make sure no other country, especially Canada, who honor convention, resolution of 1948 Geneva Convention, and accept all refugees to this country. And when we come here, we've been discriminated. Although we have unions who are trying to protect our rights at our workplace, but discrimination exists, our rights violated, and I would like to ask the government to implement some policies or strategies to stop that at the beginning. Make sure they, like those corporations, those leaders, those management aware, if they violate human rights, there would be some consequences. They don't believe or they don't practice believe in God, so financially maybe, but this is my point. Please bring that to government attention to stop it. They have to implement proper strategies because at workplace, people get discriminated big time and rights violated.
So thank you for your comment. I think it's important that government hears the message you just said. But I would go further. I don't think it's just government. I also think it's professional associations. Because one of the biggest problems that I hear from immigrants and refugees is that their professional qualifications aren't accepted in Canada. And they end up in very menial jobs despite the fact that they may have extraordinary training. And this isn't something, by the way, that's necessarily government's responsibility here in Canada. In some cases, this sort of discrimination is at the behest of professional bodies that are autonomous or semi-autonomous. And I'll give you an example. I did an article for the magazine I used to work at on the taxi industry and comparing it to Uber. And I took the City of Toronto taxi course. And I was one of 2 white people in the entire course, and most of the rest of the people were from South Asia. Most of them were from Pakistan. Most of them were far better educated than me. The guy who sat next to me was an oncologist from Pakistan, and I think he was delivering pizzas here in Toronto because he couldn't, it would take him years to get his professional accreditation. I think that man, if there were one thing that would change about the way he were treated in Canada, it wouldn't be government policy. It would be the fact that the medical profession would find ways to accommodate his incredible training and expertise and get him to put that in service of Canadians and let him provide for his family in a way that's consistent with his intellect and his training. And so, unfortunately, in a way, government is more accountable than these professional associations. You know, we can vote out a government, but it's very hard to vote out the leadership of professional associations and the self-serving rules that they have in place, some of which have racist consequences because they're there to largely to serve people who've been within the system for decades and not newcomers. So, but thank you for your comment.
We began this conference, and I think it was very good, with talking about First Nations and Canada's, I think, great problem. But still, as I look comparing the US and Canada now, and we see the train wreck going on south of the border, we're all thinking of why and can it come to Canada. To what degree do you think that multiculturalism made the difference or makes a difference? How much would you attribute to that, and what other factors do you see that differentiate the societies and how they're reacting at the moment?
One of the interesting things about multiculturalism is I think sometimes we believe that multiculturalism gets 100% buy-in from members of minority communities. That's not always the case, though. You know, again, I'm old enough to remember sort of the early stages, 70s and 80s. There are people who don't like multiculturalism precisely because it lumps in all groups together. French Canadians were vociferously opposed to multiculturalism because they saw it as a cynical ploy to just lump in French Catholics with 100 other groups. And there are Indigenous Canadians who have a real problem with multiculturalism because it makes them sometimes feel as if they're just one other group, when in fact they are the original peoples of North America. So I think multiculturalism, I mean, the word means many things. I think for a lot of people who are cynical about it, they see it as an umbrella term for white people to signal that they're tolerant and they're not bigoted. But the details of how to improve the lives of people who are affected by racism are sort of left to 100 other factors, from government policy to random social interactions to the provinces and the cities and you know, zoning restrictions on where you can build a mosque and that sort of thing. Montreal, some of the most race-sensitive decisions and religion-sensitive decisions are zoning decisions. You know, if you look at the newspapers, it's, you know, the Hasidim want to build a synagogue in this area, and they say, oh no, the parking regulations prevent you from doing that. And, you know, that has nothing to do on paper with multiculturalism, but it affects their lives. I think whether we had an official policy of multiculturalism is embedded in our Charter of Rights, so it's an official policy. But whether that existed or not, the way we react to diversity in our society is embedded in our culture. And Canada has a history of making combinations between different groups. John Ralston Saul wrote a whole book about how this has been profoundly affected, indigenous peoples have profoundly affected this aspect of our character. But it's also just something that's existed since the Plains of Abraham, where, you know, English and French, Catholic and Protestant have had to find a way to muddle along. And in our world, muddling along looks really good compared to some of the more purified ideas about national purpose and racial purity and stuff that you see in Europe and even sadly in the United States. I think a culture built on pragmatism, on compromise, on pluralism, in this day and age looks pretty good. I don't know that has a lot to do with the official doctrine of multiculturalism. I think the official doctrine of multiculturalism kind of encodes what already exists in our culture. And in the Trudeau era, it's gone further and it's become part of our national brand. What we call multiculturalism, I think, what used to be a way to accommodate the reality of a diverse country. Since Trudeau came to power and Trump came to power, I sense among many Canadians that we're actually going to go further and we're going to make this a selling point. And it's working. I mean, you have these sort of brilliant Muslim academics in the United States who are coming to Canada because they're looking for a place where they feel Islamophobia is less rife. It's become part of the Canadian advantage. And I hate to phrase it in such a cynical way, but if that cynical motivation is what makes us more tolerant and multicultural, I guess that's a good thing. We live in an age of marketing, and diversity and multiculturalism are now part of Canada's marketing campaign.
I have one last question. It's out of Montreal, and then we're going to move on to the next panel. But apparently somebody thinks you have all the answers, but they're saying, so what should we as Canada and Canadians be doing to deal with the issue of, right, because you had said intervention was at best sort of a mixed blessing.
Well, I think 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, there would have been a campaign afoot to actually mobilize militarily in Myanmar. I don't know if people remember, but when the Darfur crisis emerged in Sudan, there were people who said, let's have a full-fledged military operation in the heart of East Africa. Which I think would have ended disastrously. But such was the spirit of the time that people actually thought something like that would work. I don't think anyone actually thinks that works anymore. I think what works now is jumping on these things as early as possible and shaming the government through things as simple as images. And we've seen this time and again. You know, Mohammed al-Dura helped mobilize Palestinian activism. Kurdi helped open the doors, tragically, but helped open the doors to more refugees coming to places like Canada. The Joseph Kony video, that mobilized world attention in regard to the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. Sharing images, sharing stories is simple things as telling your friends, and media outlets like newspapers, good old-fashioned newspapers, putting these pictures on the front page. It may not cause the governments in question to sincerely question their actions, but it may lead them to believe that the path of least resistance is to act in a more humane way to their own population because they're being called out in the world stage. They're being called out too late, but at least they're being called out in some way, and that may limit the death and the suffering.
And so I'd like to introduce the moderator for our next panel, Ariella Kimmel. Ariella Kimmel is the Senior Manager Partnerships with the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. Prior to working with CIJA, Ariella worked on Parliament Hill. She is an Ottawa native and graduate of Carleton University with a Bachelor of Arts honors in Political Science and History. Ariella, please.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm honored to be the moderator of this panel. I'm really sorry about my voice and the raspiness, but this topic of this panel is the evolution of Canadian multiculturalism and the policies behind it. So today our esteemed panelists will discuss how certain policies came into effect, the impact they've had on Canadians, and the obstacles we've encountered as we've tried to create a mosaic of cultures living side by side. Our panelists will also touch on the challenges we face and how we can address them. I have to add that as the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor, this conversation is really of great importance to me. The policy of none is too many towards Jews fleeing the Nazi regime left my family stranded in Europe, and inevitably my grandmother was the only surviving member of her family. And this has had a lasting impact on our family. So, you know, over 75 years later, I think that it's of great importance that Canada has now become a beacon of hope for those fleeing persecution, but I think we have to continue to have the conversation about what that really means. So I'm honored to be a part of this. So I'd like to just introduce our panelists. The first panelist will be Dr. John Young, who began his role as president and CEO of the Canadian Museum of Human Rights in August of 2015. Prior to working with the museum, Dr. Young was an associate professor of political science at the University of Northern British Columbia, where he excelled as both an educator and administrator. During his time at UNBC, Dr. Young served as interim provost and vice president academic, and prior to that, he was the dean of the College of Arts, Social, and Health Sciences. So thank you, Dr. Young, for joining us today. I'd also like to introduce MP Arif Firani, who I have to say, reading his bio was very impressive. After a 14-year legal career advocating for human rights and access to justice as a constitutional litigator, this former Ugandan Asian refugee, Arif Firani, is proud to serve his community and country he calls home as the MP for Parkdale High Park and as Parliamentary Secretary for Multiculturalism. MP Virani has an honors BA in History and Political Science from McGill and completed his LLB at the University of Toronto. He worked as an analyst for the Canadian Human Rights Commission in Ottawa and an assistant trial attorney prosecuting genocide at the UN International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. MP Virani is the founder of Toronto's legal and aid clinic Salco, the recipient of the prestigious 2001 Harold G. Fox Scholarship and the 2008 Wilson Pritchard Award in recognition of his contributions to the legal profession and his community. So thank you, MP Virani, for joining us. And finally, I'll introduce him even though he's not here yet, but as he joins us, so you know who he is. Jagmeet Singh was born in Scarborough, Ontario, and spent part of his childhood living in St. John's, Newfoundland, and then grew up in Windsor, Ontario. Mr. Singh holds a BSc in biology from the University of Western Ontario and an LLB from the Osgoode Hall Law School. He was first elected as a member of provincial parliament for the riding of Bramley Gore Malton in 2011, and he was re-elected in 2014. When he was appointed as the Deputy House Leader and later the Deputy Leader of the Ontario NDP. As an activist lawyer, Mr. Singh offered pro bono work for community organizations fighting for social issues such as anti-poverty campaigns and immigrant and refugee rights. Recently elected as leader of the federal NDP, Mr. Singh has vowed to build a Canada where no one is left behind. So, unfortunately, when he arrives, he'll only be with us for a short period of time, but we're honored to have him join us as well, so thank you. I'd like to invite our panelists. Okay, so I'm going to start with our first question. So the genocides occurred before the enaction of multicultural policies at a time when Canadian society still held substantial prejudices against British and non-Northern European groups. To what degree did these prejudices play a role in Canada's response to these genocides? Mr. Virani, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'd just like to open just with a couple of words of introduction. Just thank you very much for having me here today. It's a distinct honor. I'm going to try this in Armenian. Shnor hakalatun. We're trying to take multiculturalism to heart at the federal level, but it's a distinct honor. I also want to just acknowledge that we're on the traditional land of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, the Huron-Wendat, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and just congratulate the Armenian National Committee and all of the joint sponsors of today's event. It really is a tremendous event. I apologize I wasn't here for the entire day, and I appreciate you've had some tremendous speakers already. You're having one of my personal idols, Erwin Kotler, afterwards, so it's a privilege to be here with John, eventually with Jagmeet, and to be here with you, Ariella, so thank you. In terms of sort of the question that you asked, I think there's no doubt the evolution of Canadian society in the 20th century played a role. I think there's no doubt that our patterns of immigration and our tolerances, for want of a better word, played a significant role. And what I mean by that is that when you talk about the Armenian genocide, when you talk about the Holocaust, when you talk about the Holodomor, and those early or mid-20th century phenomena, what you were talking about is a time when Canada, as you had mentioned in your opening, where policies like none is too many were the policy, were de rigueur, where there was a lack of understanding and perhaps as not as much of an exposure in terms of internationally what was going on overseas. I don't mean that to say that Canada was parochial or provincial, but there was certainly, in respect of the Holodomor in particular, just a genuine lack of understanding of what Stalin was doing through genocide, through famine in the 1930s. In terms of the Armenian genocide, I think that would be even more so because you're dating that back to now just over 100 years ago during the time of in and around the late teens. What you find is an evolution which I think makes the response to the crisis of Jews fleeing Nazi Europe that much more troubling because things were starting to become a bit more exposed, but the response to the MV St. Louis was a troubling one. It was a shameful one. It was an anti-Semitic response, and it's a response that I think the government of today and Canadians are just coming to terms with in terms of how horrific it was and what the horrific legacy was. I think when the camps were liberated, and I say this as partly a student of history, as you mentioned, it was when the camps were liberated that the Allied troops really understood the horrors of what took place in the Third Reich and with respect to the Holocaust, and that informed much of what you've seen in the subsequent decades, whether that's Canadian policy, American policy, etc. The readiness to accept the State of Israel and acknowledge its existence immediately after the Declaration of Independence, etc. But what I find is that as those experiences have definitely helped inform the genocides that have been unfolding more recently and unfortunately continue to unfold in terms of what we're seeing with the Rohingya. But what I mean by that is by the time you get to Srebrenica and Rwanda, obviously I'm very familiar with Rwanda as a person who prosecuted that genocide, is that you had a different era, you had much more ready journalistic access so that it was a bit more apparent to the Canadian news watcher what was unfolding. But I think you also had a development in the understanding that foreign conflicts are not simply foreign conflicts. They have a resonance in Canada, and it's important for Canadians to recognize that, and it's also important for the Canadian governments to recognize that. I'll turn it over to John.
Thanks, Arif, and thanks, Ariella. Also, my appreciation for the organizers of this very important conference. I want to agree with Arif, and then I want to qualify my agreement a little bit, if that's okay. We often change the lens through which we view things as we span history. And we should note that it was Raphael Lemkin's work in the immediate aftermath of World War II that developed the concept of genocide. He noted that it was a crime to kill a few people or an individual, and there was no known term to describe the murder or the killing of an entire race of people. And so we have this concept, genocide. He used it first retrospectively, looking back at the conquest of the Mayans, the Armenians, the Holodomor, and the Holocaust. And then we have that lens that he developed through which we view things now in our time. Was prejudice a factor in the Canadian response to these genocides? I think that's quite accurate. I would also add, I'm reminded of the words of Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, who in 1938, after Czechoslovakia was absorbed by the Germans, that's a quarrel in a faraway country about a people whom we know nothing. And that mindset, I think, may have dominated in the 30s, and we look back at it now as ignorance, and yet I think it sometimes plays a part in the ways in which we process information and news, even in our time. That prejudice and racism was manifest not only at the times of genocide, but I note that the Nanjing massacre by the Japanese forces in China happened at a time that Canada had an exclusion act that prevented Chinese immigration to Canada. Disrupting family patterns, the head tax that had been imposed decades earlier, and it gradually increased to $500 per person, meant that a Chinese immigrant who came to Canada and paid a head tax in 1922, could no longer bring his family over in the years that followed because all Chinese immigration was banned. And so we think that the Nanjing massacre was a great atrocity, but we also need to recognize that here in Canada, we had policies that reflected very distinct patterns of racism. Ariella, you already mentioned the none is too many approach of the of the Canadian Immigration Department. No Jews were allowed from the St. Louis. Very restrictive policies, not only in immigration, but also in ownership, land ownership, and property transfers. We've heard this morning some very remarkable social and societal, non-governmental responses from Canadians. We've also heard of the impediments for action against such atrocities, be they ideological or the political technology deficit, to repeat a phrase, or even the strategic priorities. This particular part of the world doesn't fit with our strategic priorities. But if prejudice was a dominant factor in the past, then this perhaps also speaks volumes if we look at a diachronic comparison between pre-Raphael Lemkin, pre-1948, looking at Canada's response to Armenia, to the Holodomor, to the Holocaust, versus Canada's response in the 1980s, the 1990s, and even today. So our response as a country to Rwanda, to Srebrenica, Mount Sinjar, to the Rohingya, we would like to think that today we are better equipped and more focused on responding through the perspective of human rights. And yet, how then do we explain our inaction or our slow movement towards action? Surely there is much to do, and there is urgency attached. At the same time, Jessica Lebranche reminded us this morning of very critical and unresolved matters related to genocide here in Canada. And I'm reminded also then of Charles Dickens' character from Bleak House, Mrs. Jellyby, constantly raising money for great causes elsewhere in the world and ignoring what was happening in her own home and in her own community. And I think that's a set of very difficult and complicated challenges that we face. So I would say yes, but I would like to qualify it, that it's not just a reflection of prejudice and bias.
Thank you. Thank you so much to both of you. The second question we're going to go to is, how successful has the implementation of multicultural policies been in introducing the stories of the diverse cultural communities into the general Canadian narrative and discussion? So thinking about how many different cultures and communities have come to Canada, how have they helped shape this country, and how have we been able to educate each other on our stories? Start.
Thanks, Ariella. The Bilingual and Bicultural Commission, the Canadian Royal Commission, got started about the same time that I was making a transition from the cradle to taking steps. It concluded some 50 years ago that the only kind of unity which can be striven for and achieved in Canada is unity and diversity, the harmonious cooperation of all ethnic groups in Canada as a whole. What followed from that report was the introduction of the multicultural policies of the Canadian government, and in the 70s and 80s, that's as I started to become more politically aware. Although I was taught something called the dual nation theory, it never really made much sense to me back then. I'm a descendant of Ukrainian and Italian immigrants and some American people moving north of the border. So I appreciated that Canada was always more than two founding nations. And since then, I have had a lifetime of experience throughout Canada and abroad. And I think we all know that Canada is well known for its embrace of diversity, and that respecting our differences is in fact our strongest common value. Not that we always do so perfectly, but that's part of our identity. And with it comes obligations and responsibilities. that we as Canadians seek to better understand one another. And that's not just in terms of folk songs and cuisine, but that we seek to know one another's stories. To strengthen this multicultural identity, we have to broaden and expand our collective memory, our public memory. And that's really what the Canadian Museum for Human Rights is all about. Our mandate is to cultivate dialogue and reflection on human rights themes, to cultivate respect for one another. Perhaps I can share a couple brief stories, if I may. In the first couple months of my position at the museum, I had an opportunity to tour one of Canada's most preeminent public historians through the museum. And for those of you who know the museum, there's 12 different galleries that are connected by these beautiful alabaster ramps. It's quite a journey. It's almost a kilometer long through the museum. We don't have a lot of artifacts. We have stories. That's the richness of the content. And we share the stories. And as we were standing in the largest gallery, Canadian Journeys, there's a great niche that tells the story of Viola Desmond. She's the black Canadian who, in the 1940s, was a businesswoman. Her car broke down. She went to watch a movie in the local theater. And she had the audacity to sit in the main section, the main part of the theater. She didn't understand that that was reserved for whites, and blacks were supposed to sit on the balcony. But she was quite adamant that she had the right to sit where she wanted. She sat there and she was arrested, thrown in jail. There were no segregation laws in Canada, as we found in the United States at the time. And in Canada, we like to think that we're a bit more pristine on such racial matters. But she was not only put in jail, she tried to defend herself in court, and she was found guilty. Guilty not of so much sitting in the wrong section of the theater, but guilty of avoiding the necessary provincial sales tax that went with the different admission price for the tickets. Rather bizarre story, and as I stood there with this very preeminent public historian, he turned to me and he said, "I did not know this story." And it dawned on me right at that moment that that is the critical role that the Canadian Museum for Human Rights plays. It seeks to expand our collective, our public memory, so that we can better not only appreciate one another, but better understand the different experiences that various Canadians have had. Over the last few years, Viola Desmond has been on the stamp. There's advertisements on television telling her story. Next year, she will be the image on Canada's new $10 bill. And these are ways to help cultivate and expand our public memory. So that's, I think, a very integral part of the work we have as Canadians in a multicultural society. Expanding our memory, better understanding one another's experiences and stories is how we knit together the various parts of our country. It's what creates unity and diversity. So we tell the stories of Harry Garbad, one of the Georgetown boys who came to Canada. Born in the Ottoman Empire, his father was taken away and murdered. Separated from his mother and his 5 siblings, he was forced into an orphanage, forced religious conversion. He escaped after a number of years, moved kind of seeking sustenance on a daily basis, survived for a few years, was finally brought to Canada as a teenager by the Salvation Army and put to work on a farm in Killarney, Manitoba. Those are the stories we collect, the stories of Johan Trollman or Gareth Jones and Malcolm Muggeridge combating the reports of Walter Duranty during the Holodomor, the story of Armin T. Wegener and the Armenian Genocide, the survivor testimony from those survivors from Indian residential schools, survivor testimony of Holocaust victims and their children. And perhaps the best way to summarize it, and I brought this down as a quote, I hope you don't mind. I like to use this quote from Senator Murray Sinclair, who was headed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And he pointed the following. He's often asked, Why don't people just move on? Why don't residential school survivors just get over it? This is what he responded. My answer has always been, why can't you always remember this? Because this is about memorializing those people who have been victims of a great wrong. It is because it's important to remember. We learn from remembering, and until people show that they have learned from this, we will never forget. And we should never forget, even once they have learned from it, because this is a part of who we are. It's not just a part of who we are as survivors and children of survivors and relatives of survivors, but part of who we are as a nation. And this nation must never forget. And that's why I think sharing the stories of our many different experiences as Canadians is part of what weaves us together as a great country. Thanks.
John's being a bit modest because his museum is actually one of the best museums in the country. And I say that as somebody with a human rights background, but as somebody who's visited it repeatedly. And if you haven't had the chance to get there, I'd strongly encourage you to do so. I think our third panelist has just shown up, so maybe we should bring him up here.
Yeah, so just to bring Mr. Singh up to where we are, we're touching on the question about the how successful the implementation of multicultural policies has been in introducing the stories of the diverse cultural communities into the general Canadian narrative. So, you know, how are all these stories of different communities that have come to Canada impacted Canada? And so we'd be happy to have you touch on that and after Reef, and then, but also I know you have an extensive background in social justice advocacy, so definitely to take some time to touch on the first one about the impact of prejudices that Canada held in response to genocides across the country. Back over to you.
Sure, so I just want to build on a bit of what John mentioned, but I should have also said at the outset that comme une députée parlementaire ici à Toronto, mais du niveau fédéral, je suis tout à fait à l'aise en français. Donc si vous avez des questions en français, n'hésitez pas à poser-le. In terms of sort of where we are now and sort of how the multiculturalism has helped develop the narrative to the point in 21st century Canada, do we feel a stronger sense of inclusion? I would strongly advocate that we do, very much so. And I'll point to a few examples, one of which I'm glad that John highlighted it, but I think when we talk about sort of multiculturalism as a narrative, it is undoubtedly something that people identify with. Your keynote, Jonathan Kay, referenced this just at the tail end of his comments, that people feel a sense of affinity with a country that allows them to not simply leave their identity at the border, that not simply leave their heritage at the frontier once they arrive in Canada. And I think the genius of the policy is that it's not that when you celebrate Armenian identity or Ukrainian identity or Ugandan Asian identity or Jewish identity, you're not threatening Canada's identity, you're actually enriching it and making it that much more complex and more nuanced. And I think the important thing that we always try to emphasize at the federal level is that you also, when we truly succeed with this kind of policy, is when we'll get to the stage where we're not just tolerating difference, but when we're truly celebrating it. And that's something that we've tangibly taken on as a government, as a mandate, to get beyond simply respecting one another, tolerating one another, but actually sort of buying into this great national exercise and celebrating difference as something that enriches us. Are there challenges? There are no doubt there are challenges, but a few other examples I think come to mind. And you know, I'm here at the Armenian Community Center, and in my first year in office, I had the privilege of serving as a parliamentary secretary to Minister McCallum when we were settling what has now become 48,000 Syrian refugees. And this location and this community was unbelievable in that exercise. And I can only say, sort of stand here in shock and awe in terms of what we saw from the Armenian community, in terms of reaching out to support Armenians, to support people of different backgrounds, to support the Syrian refugee resettlement project as a project that is part of this evolution of what it means to be Canadian. And I think it's important to emphasize that Syrian refugee resettlement because it dovetails with different projects that we've seen where our multicultural fabric really takes root and takes hold of a project. Because people would always say to us, why are there Jewish people twinning with Muslims to bring over people where a synagogue and a mosque are jointly sponsoring a family from Syria? And I think the answer is that one, we believe it's the right thing to do, but two, because we share that heritage that you mentioned. We share a heritage of diaspora communities, whether they are Ukrainians on the plains, whether they are Sikhs in the GTA, whether they are Ugandan Asians such as myself, who came here themselves as refugees. People know this idea of a journey, and they want to, once they've established here, pay that forward. And I think that's part of multiculturalism coming to bear. And with the Armenian community's efforts in terms of resettling well over 1,000 privately sponsored individuals, we saw that really coming to bear where people remembered their own voyage and wanted to help facilitate another person's voyage. I think on a symbolic level, you also see instances like as what John mentioned with respect to Viola Desmond. We have looked closely at some of the troubling aspects that we find, and there are probably many more, but there are clearly 4 that are very, very troubling right now. Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Indigenous discrimination, and anti-Black racism. And when we talk about Viola Desmond, it is critical from our government's perspective to see yourself reflected in that Canadian, in Canadian institutions, in Canadian life, in Canadian establishment organizations, and even indeed in Canadian currency. I think when you take a step to put a Black woman on a $10 bill, what you're saying to Canadians is that her story is just as much the story of Ukrainians on the prairies, it is just as much the story of Scottish people who have entered into this land, it is just as much the story of people who are including our Indigenous Canadians. And I think the other aspect that I think you can see in terms of our multiculturalism taking root is simply by virtue of who you see who you see either now seeking office or actually obtaining office, right? Now, and I'll say this with all sincerity, that when I was elected, first of all, there were some challenges in terms of pursuing any type of election. People said to me, what are you doing running in what used to be an old Polish and Ukrainian area, as a Ugandan Asian Muslim man? And I said, well, I hope that people in 2015, as it then was, will judge me based on what I bring to bear, what kind of advocate I will be, and what's between my ears, as opposed to what they visibly see in me. And thank you. And there were naysayers, and you can turn those naysayers into people that make you defeatist, and I emphasize this every time I speak to a small school group, etc. Or you can turn those naysayers into fuel. And that fueled my fire and made me determined to go out there and pursue and pursue and pursue. And the fact that I was elected in a riding with that kind of demographic breakdown, I think is a testament to Canada. The fact that there are 43 MPs that are born from outside of this country is a testament to Canada. That there are 10 Muslims and 7 Jews in Parliament is a testament to this country. The fact that the 3rd most widely spoken language in Parliament, and I always test the kids when I have them on this, it's English and French are 1 and 2, obviously, and the 3rd most widely spoken language is Punjabi, right? That's a tremendous statement about Canada, and it causes jokes amongst my family, right? So I'm married into a family from Uttar Pradesh. My wife is of Jain background, and her relatives, they get on the phone with me. They're like, there's more Sikhs in your parliament in your cabinet than there are in ours. So obviously Justin Trudeau's onto something. But I say that just because it serves as a good pedestal that multiculturalism really starts to bear fruit when you can have people who can aspire to be parliamentarians and who can achieve the greatest heights and are valued and are deemed to feel that their personal experiences are welcome. And I'll finish with just this point, and I'm very proud that we now have a leader of a national party who himself is part of that multicultural fabric. And it's an honor to share the stage with you, Jagmeet. And the point I'll finish on is that we are trying to manifest this multiculturalism because I agree with you, John, that it requires steps to be taken. Jonathan Kay mentioned that, it's organizations, but others from the audience mentioned it's got to be government as well. But in terms of sort of working on diversifying appointments, that's a tangible step we're trying to take as a government to say, when you look at the Senate, or indeed when you look at the judiciary, something I obviously feel strongly about as a lawyer, is that you need to ensure that that bench reflects the litigants that are coming before it. And that's something that we're working hard on in terms of gender diversity, in terms of visible minorities, in terms of Indigenous persons. There's a long, long way to go, but it is important that you deem those kinds of life experiences equally as meritorious as the degrees you have after your name, the number of reported cases you have in legal journals, etc. Because those life experiences help inform the kind of justice we mete out and how we govern ourselves as a society. So is multiculturalism bearing fruit? It absolutely is. Is there a lot of work to do? No doubt. But I think we're on the right track, and I think you can gauge that by who you're seeing being appointed, who you're seeing being elected, and by communities like this stepping forward on a great refugee exercise that is still evolving as we speak. Thank you.
Well, I want to begin by saying, Inch Besses. Hope everyone's doing well. Yes, love them. Excellent. And Shanora Garam for letting me be here with you today. I think it's always important to acknowledge the traditional lands that we're gathered on. And I think that's a powerful thing that we do as Canadians, acknowledging the lands we're gathered. And I'm sure there was already an acknowledgement before, but I'd like to add my voice to acknowledge that we're gathered on the territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, and more recently the Mississaugas of New Credit. I also think it's important to not only acknowledge the land, but to acknowledge the languages spoken. And I just know a little bit of the languages. My goal is to always be able to speak some words of not just the people's tribes, but also the peoples in terms of the languages. So Muju and Ani. I just want to take a quick moment to thank the Armenian Community Center of Cambridge, the Armenian National Committee of Canada, the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, who have had a great pleasure of working with a lot, Atlantic Canadian Congress, Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, and the HREC Association. For me, the question, and I think what is so amazing about our country, is that when we talk about multiculturalism, we back it up with something concrete. And what I talk about when I talk about multiculturalism, one of the things that to me is a very powerful thing is as a nation, we've supported the recognition of genocides. And I want to share with you, as a member of a genocide surviving community, I actually look with a lot of respect, but in a lot of ways I'm also a little bit jealous of the Armenian community for your incredible journey in fighting to recognize the genocide perpetrated against your community. It is an incredible story, a powerful story, a community that's relatively smaller that has worked so hard to achieve that recognition here in Canada, and then continues to work to recognize the genocide. And recently, we've seen recognition in Germany. And I want you to know that when a community works to recognizing an injustice suffered against its own people, you're doing not only a service for your own community, honoring those lives that were lost, you're actually doing an incredibly important job for the rest of humanity by saying, we denounce this type of hatred. We denounce the acts which led to this heinous act. So anytime we remember a genocide, anytime we acknowledge that horrible suffering and that loss of life, we're acknowledging not only the harm done to that community, but we're collectively saying, let us denounce this to ever happen again. And that's why I think it's so important that the work that's been done, both by the Jewish, or by all communities, the Jewish community with respect to the Holocaust, the Holodomor with respect to the Ukrainian community, the Armenian genocide. And I think it's also important for us to acknowledge there's so many more injustices we need to acknowledge so that we can move forward as a society. The Tamil community is facing, or has faced, a horrible genocide as well in Sri Lanka. Right now we're seeing the Rohingya community facing an ongoing, right now in our eyes, right now we're seeing this happen, so we need to be standing together to denounce that. And right now we know also that there's ongoing issues of human rights violations, and I think it's our collective responsibility to denounce them, to stand up against them. You must have seen, a lot of folks have seen, there's a video that went kind of viral where I was interrupted at an event and someone came up and tried to say some hurtful and hateful things and attack me. And people said to me, well, why didn't you just clarify that you weren't a Muslim? They seem to be attacking you, and you could have just said very quickly, sorry, ma'am, that's not what I am. And I can say that the issue of being approached that way or being confronted that way wasn't unique. I faced things like that throughout my life. And every time I've been faced with Islamophobia, my answer has never been, I'm not a Muslim. It has always been that hate is wrong, period. That's it. But the reason for that is very important, because hate is like a fire. Once we allow hate to grow, it spreads. And it spreads, and it means that we'll see an increase. If we allow Islamophobia to grow, we've seen the connection to anti-Semitism. We've seen the connection to allowing the climate to begin to hate someone based on their sexuality, their gender, or other factors. Hate is not isolated. So it's another thing if we want to talk about supporting and celebrating our identity and denouncing the human rights violations that have occurred in the history of our society that continue to exist. We also need to ensure that we stop hate in its tracks. We need to collectively denounce the act of hate, any policies or any legislation that encourage that sort of divisive politics. It's our collective responsibility. And recently we've seen the administration in the South use their position to create climate, again, a climate of hate. I think it needs to be called out. We need to stand up and say that's not acceptable. Hate is not acceptable, and politics and tweets that divide our communities, that sow this idea to permit that it's okay to hate needs to be denounced and called out and stopped. And I want you to know that as a person that's faced some of these issues, and the folks on this panel can also talk about this as well, that I want you to know that I'm an ally in the journey towards fighting for more human rights, into acknowledging the injustice that our society continues to perpetuate, but with inspiring the hope that there will be a time and a society where we celebrate all of our unique elements, where we celebrate our identity, where we don't see divisive politics, and where we unite one to build a world that's inclusive, that's just, where no one's left behind. And I look forward to building that world together with you. I just got to apologize. I didn't have a lot of time today. I really wanted to make it here. I drove straight in from Windsor and jumped out of the car after about 4 hours and ran onto the stage. I have to go to another event as well, so I apologize for being so brief in terms of my time with you, but it's very important to be here. So thank you for the honor to be able to share a couple of words. Thank you for being able to share the stage with you all, and thank you to our incredible moderator. And I apologize again for the short amount of time that I had today, but it was truly an honor to be able to share some moments with you and some words with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jagmeet, for joining us, and we're going to now move to the questions from portions.
We do have a number of questions. We'll start with the first one that was handed in. It's three questions, but really they can be tied into each other. So, how do you see Canada progressing as a multicultural country in the years to come? And in that sense, what will Canada look like with its current multicultural policy? In your viewpoint, in 2013, 2040, 2050? And what will be the biggest challenge that Canada will face eventually in the next quarter of a century in terms of its multicultural policy? And so these are not directed to specific panelists. It's open, so whoever would like to take first stab at it, please feel free.
How do I see Canada progressing into the future? And then what are the biggest challenges? I take remarkable satisfaction that the Canadian Museum for Human Rights exists. 16 years ago, people thought it was a crazy idea, that you could have a museum that focused on the broad topic of human rights. And there were many naysayers that this thing would ever get off the ground. The fact that it is now among Canada's most beautiful buildings, the fact that it is the #2 place to visit in Canada, according to USA Today, after Quebec City, the fact that we have integrated many disparate stories into a common experience for the visitor, I think is a testament that this is not just an audacious project, but that it is an audacious project that has come into existence. I think back to some of the cynics back in the early 1970s who thought Canada's multicultural policy was somewhat misguided. I think to scholars and academics who constantly raise questions whether diversity can be an end in itself or whether it is just a means to accomplish something. But I think that as an audacious project, it has now become Canada's core identity. That's not to say there aren't many challenges and difficulties, and there are things that we need to do to better embrace who we are and who we are becoming. So the mandate of the museum is to reflect upon the successes and the sacrifices of previous generations, but also to highlight the things that we could have done better and need to do better to improve upon them and to pass them on to the next generation. So education is a critical part of the museum experience. We seek to provide educative opportunities for students all the way from K through grade 12 to the university, and for all of us who want to continue learning. But I think that's our biggest challenge, in that diversity from a different perspective can look like confusion and chaos, but to recognize that it is our strength, and that unity and diversity comes when we better understand one another, that requires action. Remembrance, and to remember is not a passive experience. Learning the perspective of another is not just a passive experience. It requires effort. And as we build a better future for Canada and we try to be a beacon or a example for the world, there's things that we need to improve upon internally. And greatest among those is our internal efforts for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. We've made some serious mistakes. We've done things poorly. And rather than hide from it, we need to be very upfront about it and use that as something we pass on to the next generation, that it can be better than what we received.
Okay. Rafe, please.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly, Savag, that I think three questions, three responses. So how will Canada be progressing as a multicultural nation? I just think you'll see simply more and more diversity manifesting itself throughout the country. We know the recent census data demonstrates that the city of Toronto is 51 or 52% racialized communities. So the visible minority has become the visible majority. I think you'll see that not just in urban centers around the country, but you also see that in smaller centers throughout the country, in terms of that changing nature of who is in Canada, and the fact that we are using immigration as a tool for growth, and we're aggressively using it as a tool for growth. You will note that immigration levels, we put it on a 3-year plan to raise levels to 310, 320, and eventually 340,000 individuals, is a statement about what Canada needs to be competitive, but also about the changing nature of who is Canadian and who will be identifying with this country. I think in 2030, 2040, what you'll see in terms of Canada is the leadership and international notoriety that I think John was touching on, as in terms of a country that is re-engaged with the world, that is showing leadership, whether it's responses to migrant crises around the planet or whether it's responses to human rights issues around the planet. But I think it's also something that it dovetailed with what Jonathan Kay mentioned, and I'll put it even more bluntly, that we are already seeing that our diversity is a competitive strength and a competitive advantage. We are seeing foreign companies, particularly American companies, moving their head offices north simply to take advantage of our immigration rules, of our globally competitive marketplace, of the fact you can have somebody who speaks Ukrainian who can do business in Kiev, or equally somebody who speaks Marathi and can do business in Bombay, or somebody who speaks Mandarin and can do business in Beijing. These are good things for the Canadian economy, and they make us an enviable place to do business. And I think in 2030, 2040, you will see Canada emerging in that role. And I think the challenge will be, however, making sure that the integration exercise, the diversity exercise, the fruits of it are borne by everyone. And I think John mentioned this a little bit earlier in our first round of questions, but it's this idea that there is work to be done. For as much as we are doing internationally, there's a lot of work to be done on the ground here in Canada, whether it's with racialized communities, newer communities, different religious groups. We can talk about the plight of Indigenous communities, the plight of the Black community, but there's an effort that needs to be made to ensure that the great economic engine and the success of that economic engine is shared across the board. And on one point I will note, it references something that Jonathan Kay mentioned, but it's this idea about credential recognition. We know that story all too well about the overqualified Pakistani cab driver. But the idea is we have to work collaboratively to ensure that those people are meeting their full human potential. And they're doing it here. And that's partly, I'm looking at my own profession. I'm the lawyer, the Law Society of Upper Canada, the pharmacists, the engineers, the doctors, the dentists. These are self-governing professions for a reason, but there's a role for the federal government to play in breaking down those barriers or getting people at least at the table talking about why it's important, whether it's an Armenian, a Ukrainian, a Jewish individual, a Ugandan individual. It doesn't matter the background, but making sure that they can meet their full potential here in Canada will ensure that full economic success model is shared by everyone. And that's the biggest challenge from our perspective going forward. We're investing in it right now, but it needs to be done more aggressively in order to ensure that that challenge doesn't become insurmountable.
Thank you. The next question, I think, is directed more to the organizers, so we'll leave that, and we'll make sure to answer it after. So next up, in the context of the evolution of multiculturalism in Canada, to what degree would you say that the Canadian version of multiculturalism is becoming post-multiculturalist, as we broaden and integrate the notion of collective and shared culture, history, and values? Quite the theoretic question, I think. But
Well, I think it raises questions, what is meant by multiculturalism. I think in the early origins in the 70s, it seemed to be more about recognition of the diversity of Canada, but also as a policy, it was funding to ethnic groups and let them hang on to their identity more than it was. More than it has emerged, I think, today. Let me share a brief story. When I used to teach university, I used to have a lecture about human rights, and I used to rely on Michael Ignatiev's work. And Ignatiev talked about the human condition. Core to the human condition and the value of the human condition is agency or choice. And then he took it a step further and said, if we exercise our agency, if we use that opportunity to make choices, there's going to be differences among us. So if we respect agency, we have to respect differences. And then he concluded, therefore, if you want to defend human rights, you have to defend difference. And he took a book to do that, to make that point, and I would take maybe a 45, 50-minute lecture and thought I did a great job. But early on at the museum, there was a group of grade 3 students going through the museum. And there was a young boy named Spencer, 8 years old, hair all akimbo. And I looked at him, I said, Spencer, what did you learn here at the museum? And he said, human rights means everyone has the right to be different. And I thought, there it is, an 8-year-old gets it. And so, for me, multiculturalism is more than the cuisine we eat or the songs we sing. It is very much related to that respect for differences among us. Because if we believe in agency, we have to recognize that agency can be used to pursue different ends. And I would like to think that we can live in a world where respect for agency is a two-way street, and that is at the core of Canada's commitment to unity through diversity, or multiculturalism, that it's not post-multiculturalism, or it's not just a focus on different identity. It is a shared value that we have, that we can respect the differences among us.
I've thought about the question, and I think I understand it a bit better now, but I'll just offer sort of a couple of observations. I think as multiculturalism morphs and sort of adjusts to sort of the current circumstances, we reflect on sort of the concept, which came from Paul Yuzik, tremendous Ukrainian Canadian, entrenched in policy by Pierre Trudeau in 1972 at a AGM for the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. And as it's gone through the decades since 72, it's definitely taken on different examples, different policy orientations, undoubtedly. I think what I would reflect on in terms of multiculturalism in its 2017, is it postmodern, however you sort of categorize its current incarnation, to my mind, it sort of resonates with a couple of ideas. One is that words matter, and secondly, the idea that memories matter. On the words matter point, I think it's very important that multiculturalism today captures in stark black and white terms what we are talking about. And thus you see intensive discussions about things such as the nature of discrimination we're seeing right now, things like Islamophobia, calling it out exactly by the term it is, because words indeed do matter. You see apologies, and there have been criticisms about, are there too many apologies happening right now? I think in this day and age, it is important to acknowledge historic injustices, including through the words of elected representatives, including from the highest office in the land. So you've seen apologies about the Komagata Maru incident, which is the incident of the boat full of primarily Sikh individuals that was denied safe harbor in Vancouver in around 1910, 1914. A historic injustice and embarrassing example of Canadian intolerance of the time, but acknowledged by the Prime Minister and apologized for. Very recently, the LGBT apology, where again, words matter. And because I think it's important not only for those words to be articulated by a Prime Minister in terms of current sort of approaches towards tolerance, etc., but it's also important because those words are informative, which brings me to the second point, that memories matter. When you have these apologies, you actually learn about what historic discrimination looked like. It is teased out, it is fleshed out in a narrative where you learn about the RCMP, the Armed Forces treatment of LGBT individuals, and it was literally a witch hunt to purge them from the Canadian public service. And in terms of continuing to ensure that those memories are enshrined, it brings us back to something that John has been mentioning, that you have a human rights museum. You have monuments that are dedicated to significant issues and significant events. We've had now consecrated a national Holocaust monument in Ottawa that will be created. The service was about a month ago. We have a memorial to the victims of communism for Ukrainians, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Vietnamese. I mean, the list is long of people that were subjugated by the communist regime. You have what will be a Holodomor monument right here in Toronto, again, to capture that memory and to keep it alive well beyond the longevity to the lifespans of those who fell victim to those horrific crimes, but to ensure that through those monuments, through those stories, through that evidence, that the memory continues to remain alive. And I think multiculturalism, to me, in this postmodern 2017 sort of incarnation, is about words and it's about the memories.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. The next question, probably for Dr. Young, although nothing has been specified, but what efforts has the Canadian Museum for Human Rights made to get those different experiences and stories along with their lessons into the school system in Canada?
What efforts? Magnificent efforts, actually, and magnificent results. We're approaching now almost 100,000 students coming through the museum through four specific educational programs. We've worked with the Holodomor Education Group, with the Indigenous Educators Working Group. We've worked with the 10 provincial ministries of education and 3 territories to make sure that we provide courses and programs that connect with their specific provincial curriculum. We've worked with universities across the country and even abroad. We've had a university from France bringing students to the museum. So the education role of the museum, I think, has been greatly advanced. And again, it's really about impact, though. You know, we can talk about numbers, but to watch students view a film that talks about anti-Semitism in Canada and talks about the St. Louis and the none too many response at a time when Canadians are wrestling with Syrian refugees, you see the aha moments that these past experiences can help inform or shape our responses to current events. Irving Abella, who wrote None is Too Many, told me that when he first wrote it some 40 years ago, he got a response from a senior official in Canadian immigration, who was wrestling with the Vietnamese refugee crisis. And it was that story about the St. Louis that helped the Canadian government understand what its response should be to the Vietnamese boat people. And so we learn from these experiences, and it's part then of our educational programming. We have, I think, 13 different programs, 12 very much specific to educational programs, be they the Holodomor, the Armenian Genocide, the Holocaust, Indigenous rights today, the Indian residential school system, and other topics. And we also have a program called the Mikanikeya, the Spirit Tour, where the museum is used to help explain and share the sacred teachings from Indigenous perspectives. Each one of those programs continues to be a work in progress. Each time we offer it, we learn more and how to shape it, how to share it again, and we look forward to adding more programs going forward.
Thank you. It's actually quite difficult reading those handwritings, but try my best. I think this is for Mr. Virani. The late Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau began multicultural policy in early 1971. Prime Minister Mulroney legalized multicultural policy, the Multicultural Act, in 1988. Since then, federal support for multiculturalism has been reduced, where the department is almost non-existent. What is going to be the future of the multicultural department and generally the policy? I think the second part has been addressed already, but maybe more so about the department of multiculturalism.
Terrific question. The multiculturalism has gone through ebbs and flows in terms of its prioritization by different governments. It has had, at times, more funding resources dedicated to it rather than not. What I can say to the audience and what I can say to all of you is that multiculturalism is taken on a renewed focus for the Government of Canada. I work in this capacity with Minister Mélanie Joly, the Minister of Canadian Heritage, and she has me as a second parliamentary secretary in this role, dealing with specifically multiculturalism issues. That role did not exist in year one of our mandate, and in appointing a second parliamentary secretary into this role, it was an acknowledgement that more focus, more attention, and indeed more policies, programming, and ideally more funding needs to be dedicated. You can rest assured we are putting in a strong effort internally as we approach Budget 2018 about what could be done with more robust approach to multiculturalism. The specific things that we are hearing about are things that used to work very, very well in the past, things like empowering different communities, things like dedicating resources to fighting discrimination in particular. The attendees of this conference should know that the monies that we do have, we've already targeted towards combating prejudice, racism and discrimination. That's through something that we call the interaction funding. But what we'd like to do is laser in on that as a specific focus and dedicate even more resources to it. We've just had a very robust committee study on systemic racism and things like religious discrimination, exploring ideas such as interfaith work, such as how we would dedicate more funding into the envelope. I think the future of multiculturalism is robust, but it depends on one, leadership from elected officials, and also leadership from departmental officials. The portfolio had moved around from a few different ministries under the previous government. It now finds its home at Heritage, which I think is the historic home where it's been, and we're trying to develop that capacity to ensure that we are addressing the needs of the communities that are here organizing this type of conference, but also addressing the needs that we feel are very acute. And again, it brings me back to something that was asked of Jonathan Kay. You know, sometimes Canadians are great at looking abroad and sort of pointing fingers at, you know, there are other areas far abroad or closer to home that are experiencing challenges, but we know those challenges manifest right here in Canada as well. We know that there have been incidents at its most dramatic. We had the Quebec mosque shooting on January 29th of this year, but on a more benign level, we find people that are very much empowered and feel emancipated to voice concerns, sentiments, or views that most of us find anathema. Obviously, people have every right in the world to express those views. That's what the Charter protects. As a constitutional lawyer, I will defend that to my dying day. Section 2B of the Charter is something to always be valued. But at the same time, we need to work positively, actively, and in a way that is robust in terms of dollars, resources, and funding to combat divisions when we see them arising, and to demonstrate that hatred is not something that we accept as Canadians, and that we will work to combat it. And that means, in part, a more robust approach on multiculturalism. That's something that I firmly believe in. That's why I think I'm in this role. And Minister Joly has always given me full support in terms of advocating that, in terms of developing going forward.
Thank you. Next up, within Canada, we have social and economic problems. Do you think that there are unique approaches from our different communities to these specific issues?
Yes. But I'm reminded of the conversation this morning that talked about different social responses to some of the particular events, such as the Armenian genocide and the interfaith response in the 1920s. You know, we often look to government to help fund or decide to act. And yet the strength of Canada has always been found in our social responses amongst our groups, our communities, our towns, our churches, our organizations. And it's great when we work in partnership, but I think, you know, say, look at Germany and the challenges that follow from the Syrian refugee crisis, with many Syrian refugees housed in government housing, no interaction with members of the local community, etc. And then compare it with the response of Canada, a great partnership between social groups, organizations, and the government. And then meeting the refugees who have, I believe I can use the word friends that they meet. They become absorbed into the Canadian community. And I think that's the strength that Canada has to offer. And so, yes, there can be some differences, but perhaps there should be, based on the fact that we want social groups, organizations, to be a fundamental part of our activities.
I think on the social economic front and on the integration piece, we can learn a lot from, there's a component of sort of government creating a framework and mechanisms that allow and facilitate the social and economic integration, and there's a component of sort of stepping out of the way and letting communities, private sector, individuals, businesses play a role. I think what's important on things such as, you know, the response to the migrant crisis, one thing that was struck home to me again and again and again is that we believe firmly as a government policy towards facilitating people's integration by ensuring that they have a sense of permanence. And what I mean by that is that, and I was there for that very first plane and for many planes after it that were arriving with refugees from the Syrian refugee exodus. And what was amazing is that for all of the 48,000 individuals who have come, upon arrival in Canada, they have permanent resident status. What's fascinating, and I appreciate everything that Germany has done, but out of the 850,000 individuals brought in by the German government, 40,000 were given permanent status. Over 800,000 were given a temporary status, which creates a sense of an unknown, a bit of a limbo. And that limbo we have seen through evidence, and we are a government that believes firmly in evidence-based policy, is that impedes full integration because people don't know whether they have a full and final home and a future home and a place in their new country that they've settled in. And we've tried to ensure that by ensuring permanent residency and then also facilitating the path to citizenship by reducing barriers, whether it's language testing, the age cohorts that are available, the number of years. It used to be 4 years out of 6 to qualify for citizenship. We've reduced that to 3 out of 5 because we believe firmly that once people have that permanent sense of official legal status in a country, that proceeds to allow them to have better economic outcomes, health outcomes, educational outcomes. They start to volunteer in their communities. They become coaches of the local sports teams, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That kind of piece is where government control leadership. But on the private side, I firmly agree with John that there is a component where communities need to step up and have been stepping up. And that's, again, I'd refer back to the intense private sponsorship efforts we saw with the Armenian community right here in this very building and right here in this part of what I used to call Willowdale. I used to live not far from here, so I still call it Willowdale. But those efforts made by the community to demonstrate that we're going to offer people a helping hand, show them where the daycares are, how to access the supermarket, how to visit the doctor. That's the kind of community response that facilitates that integration and that helps break down any of those social economic barriers that I think the questioner might have been referencing. Thank you.
Thank you again. We had another question about the credential issues and the interprovincial barriers for newcomers, but I think that was well addressed within this panel and also through the keynote speech delivered by Jonathan Kay. The last question we have, and after which we'll let the panel wrap up, and then we have a very short announcement to make. So the last question, oftentimes Canada's multicultural policies, amongst other things, are compared to those of the United States. These can often lead to a culture of self-satisfaction and resting on our laurels. The comparison, especially to the current US administration, can be dangerous as there's still lots of room for improvement. How can Canada shake off this better by comparison mentality in order to continue making strides in our treatment of minorities, immigrants, and refugees?
The standard metaphors have been for the American melting pot versus the Canadian mosaic, and I use the phrasing, you know, that diversity is part of our strength. If we use that metaphor of a mosaic, we're really looking at not just fragmented pieces, which if you go up really close and look at any mosaic, it seems like just a bunch of little pieces glued together, and one can lose the perspective of the bigger picture, which a mosaic, where the wealth and richness of a mosaic is always more evident, not in the small pieces, but the picture that it creates. So rather than, you know, a melting pot or a large stew where every ingredient adopts the same flavor, I like the metaphor of a mosaic, and I like drawing attention to the fact that a beautiful mosaic is a great work of art. And it is, those pieces are adhered together with some common elements. There's purposes to it. And it's easy to maybe misjudge, misplace, or to lose the importance of the larger picture that a mosaic creates. And that's why I think this concept of respect and respect for human rights and a common collective public memory that we work on and continue to work on helps draw attention away from each individual piece to focus on the larger picture.
I think it's a great question, and I think it's difficult to answer it in a way that's satisfactory to all. But the way that we ensure we don't rest on our laurels is simply to constantly strive to do better. I mean, it's something that we work on at the national level within Parliament to consider better ways of doing things and to consider that there are definitely different ideas that are out there that can help us improve upon what is a great national experiment in terms of building this multicultural fabric. What we can do in terms of not being satisfied is to constantly push. And I'll give you a tangible example, and it actually furrows people's brows around the planet, because I've had the ability to work in different places like East Africa on the War Crimes Tribunal, or India with some human rights NGOs. But we have restored a program that had existed for some time and then was unfortunately cut. But we've restored a program called Court Challenges. And a lot of people don't know about this program, but it's basically the government giving money to groups and lawyers to challenge government legislation under the Charter. And not only have we restored this program, we've actually expanded its scope. But I think that's important because it's indicative of sort of this Canadian mindset that when you challenge a government's legislation in court and sometimes win, causing our legislation to be struck down and redesigned or amended to make it compliant with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, you're not doing something that's insulting to the government or insulting to Canada. You're helping to create a more inclusive and better Canada. And we firmly believe in that in terms of being the right way forward, because through those types of challenges, you get the accommodation of same-sex spouses, you get the accommodation of things such as indigenous individuals, you get the accommodation of things under equality rights analysis, where you get a more inclusive society, a more diverse society, which ultimately reflects better on all of us. There's other tangible examples, steps that we've taken where we're trying to do this at a national level to ensure that we're not just resting on our laurels, as the questioner asked. Things like compelling diversity on corporate boards. Like, we can talk all we want about ensuring the Pakistani gentleman is no longer driving a taxi cab and becomes an engineer, but it's an entirely different discussion if it's a female Pakistani engineer and whether she's at the table of the boardroom that's running that engineering firm. That's those barriers that ultimately we have to sort of traverse, and we're trying to do that and show leadership on that by bills like C-25, which is a bill that was debated in this parliament about compelling diversity on those boards. We're also doing things very tangibly about name-blind projects at the federal parliament and within federal departments where we know unconscious bias still exists. When people have a different name, whether it's a long Armenian name or a long South Asian name, or a long name from any other part of the world, sometimes those names, if they're not names that are very simple and more British in their origins, result in unconscious bias and create barriers for people gaining employment. So we're working on pilot projects to remove the names from the equation and seeing how that will affect people's chances of being hired. So what I would say to the questioner is that the idea is that we need good ideas. We're trying to work on good ideas, but there are many other good ideas out there to try and pierce ultimately that economic integration barrier, whether it's job attainment or job qualifications or ultimately higher levels of economic success. Those ideas are out there, but it's creating an environment that allows those ideas to come to the fore, that stimulates those ideas, where those ideas are debated at conferences or symposia, et cetera. That's not resting on your laurels, and I think that's the Canada that we need to be, that we strive to be, and that we hopefully will always be in the future.
I just want to thank our panelists. You know, I'm pretty lucky and thankful that every day I get to go to work, and my job is to build relationships between the Jewish community and other communities on anything to help make Canada a better place. And especially the Armenian National Canadian community and the Ukrainian Canadian community have been really strong allies and partners in speaking up with us against hate crime and a lot of other issues. So I'm so thankful for that, and I'm really thankful to have had the opportunity to share this stage with MP Varani and Dr. Young and Jagmeet and Absentia. So thank you so much, and I know Savag has a little announcement, but thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ariella, MP Varani, and Dr. Young. As always, it was amazing. Just a very quick announcement. So we were approached by Dr. Stacey Churchill, who's here with us today, Professor Emeritus at the University of Toronto, and he wanted to share some insights about Canada's multicultural policy at its making. And he's a gentleman and a scholar who, at the time, was also involved in that process. And without further ado, I would like to invite him up to the stage to share his experience and an interesting part of that policy making that took place decades ago.
Thank you for allowing me to speak. This is really a rare privilege. First, my wife was on the first panel, now my member of parliament. I haven't been to the local meetings this month. But thank you very much. I wanted to make a little footnote to all of this because the topic is the evolution of Canadian multiculturalism. As a young person appointed to a senior administrative post at the University of Toronto, I was very close to being present in a non-political role at the very genesis of this. A few months before Prime Minister Trudeau made his statement in Parliament about multiculturalism within a bilingual framework, I was given the task of organizing a secret meeting where it was going to be dry run with ethnics from across Canada. Now remember, this was the response of the Canadian government to Volume 4 of the report of the Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism, labeled The Other Ethnic Groups. I was one of only 2 people who were not part of this secret consultation. It was quite interesting. I enjoyed it immensely. And as I was thinking of I began to think about this initially in the context of our panelists. I was present at this Canada-wide meeting where there were about 10 people present. I do think there were a couple of people who had black hair, but there was no one who was not white. White in the sense of being of immediate European immigrant or other similar descent. It brings us now to this point. I'd like to remind everyone about the evolution, that this policy came in at a moment when large sectors of Canada's population rejected the idea that French should be given status equal to English. Some oddity for a person with my Anglo-Saxon name, I gradually became involved strongly with Francophones outside Quebec and was able to follow the evolution of these policies over a period of many years, and I've seen some evolution. One of the biggest, I think, was I worked with, at one point, with my wife actually, I worked with the Federation of Francophone Communities outside Quebec and helped them develop a policy which in a certain way represents one of the more fine ways of thinking about matters. They were dealing with the issue of founding peoples, and I had pointed out to them that there's no way that you can demand rights for Francophones without demanding rights for the people who were here before you were. And they made a statement on language and multiculturalism, which is very interesting. They referred to Canada's 3 founding peoples as being the Francophone community, the Anglophone community, and the Indigenous community, to write them off as being a single monolithic whole, whereas they represent a great diversity of languages, cultures, and world philosophies. Now, this was a change around 1990, and as I think back on it, I think again of the transition from this period where everything was about resisting French to the New World. And I have a treasured Xerox of a newspaper cartoon, which in the context of today's panel, I think I would like to leave you with. It was a cartoon in which it said, the title was The Bigot's Worst Nightmare. In the background, there was Parliament of Canada. And in front of it was standing a member of the RCMP wearing a turban and saying, bonjour. If anything symbolizes the change, it is having our country's armed forces being led by a person who wears a turban, by having a leader of one of our parties wearing a turban, and where a discussion of multiculturalism appropriately has one panelist who is, of course, of European descent. Thank you very much.